One of the few facts about the history of the interpretation of the Bible that's widely known outside the halls of academia is that a man called James Ussher once calculated that the creation took place on a certain day in October 4004 BC. I have with me one of the greatest living authorities on James Ussher, Professor Alan Ford, and I can't resist asking him, James Ussher, why is he important? Why are you interested? What's his reputation?
You've hit the nail on the head. I'm very disappointed you didn't come up with the right date. It was the 23rd of October.
I knew it was in October. Can we?
Indeed. But it was actually the evening before the 23rd of October. This is, you're absolutely right, the reason why Ussher is famous. His Annals of the Old and New Testament, published 2 years after his death in 1658, which set to count backwards from the present day through known historical events and linking them to the Bible, counting backwards through all the patriarchs in the Bible until we get to Adam, and by combining all the skills of contemporary history, chronology, science, use of calendars, astronomy, Ussher managed to establish to his own and contemporary satisfaction that the earth had been created in 4004 BC. And that's why he's known today. That date was inscribed in many of the Bibles in the 18th and 19th centuries in the margins, and is, of course, popularized today by modern creationists. In 2003, two American creationists translated Ussher from, as they say, Old English into modern English, and republished the Annals of the Old and New Testament. And it's become, if you like, one of the standard works of modern creationists. It's somewhat ironic because, of course, what Ussher was doing there was using, to the best of his knowledge, all the available contemporary scientific and academic evidence about the Bible, the world, history, creation, to date the creation of the world. And I'm afraid the sad but logical conclusion is that if Ussher, who was a professor in Trinity College Dublin in the early 17th century, if he was a professor of Trinity College Dublin in the early 21st century, using that same combination of knowledge as I'm sure he would want to, being an exceptionally good scholar, he would come to a very different conclusion that I suspect wouldn't please the creationists.
And of course, the other interesting thing is that James Ussher is always given the credit for the 4004 date, but actually he was tweaking a date that had been arrived at 1300 years earlier by Eusebius and by Jerome. And it was Jerome's chronicle. He was tweaking it because of the difference between the Hebrew and the Greek numbers.
There was a whole series of contemporaries who'd been working on this, Scaliger and so on. Chronology was a massive industry at the time. And Ussher was basically fitting this to a certain assumption about the length of the world, based very loosely upon the Jewish idea that each day of creation was 1,000 years. There was an assumption by Ussher and by many contemporaries that the world was going to last for 6,000 years. So that therefore his arriving at the date of 4004 BC seemed to fit very neatly with the fact that there was then 2,000 years 4,000 years until the birth of Christ. And then after the birth of Christ, the world would last for another 2,000 years, which meant that if you were living in the year 16, or dying, as in his case, in the year 1656, then there wasn't very much time left in the world. And that was the way in which people viewed it, which meant that things like apocalyptic and fears for the end of the world were extraordinarily powerful because you had this completely compressed timescale. The world was only going to last for 6,000 years.
And of course, the neatness of the 4004 was the awareness by the 16th century that Dionysius Exiguus had dated the birth of Christ 4 years out. Yes. So it took place in 4 BC. Yes. 4 days of the creation were up, yeah. So it was 4004. Yeah. So it was going to be 1996 yeah. that would have been the end. So actually we're on borrowed time.
Well, you mustn't count the year naught, though.
No, you must, sorry, it's 1993. Or is it 1995? Let's not worry about that. The interesting thing is that this calculation, which looks to us like history, was actually being done to locate his present and to locate the future. If you know all that biblical stuff, you're actually not finding out something about the Bible. You're finding out something about your own present location in time.
Absolutely. And we have a different location in time, which gives us a very different perspective, which makes creationism to seem to us quite quaint. But let me change the subject of discussion, if you like, in a way. That's the aspect which Ussher is mostly known for. We have a publishing event, which is just happening at the moment as I speak. The Irish Manuscripts Commission is publishing a 3-volume edition of Ussher's correspondence. A wonderful edition by Elizabeth Anbor, an Ussher scholar, which she's been working on intensively for the last 10 years. It's a terrifying publishing enterprise because, of course, Ussher spoke every known language under the sun, and his letters contain Aramaic, Syriac, Hebrew, Latin, Greek, and therefore transcribing them is a real challenge, which they've risen to. What this has brought home to me was the extent to which Ussher was a man of letters, corresponding across the whole of Europe. He is, I think, one of the greatest ever Irish scholars who mastered such a range of skills. He was, first and foremost, I think, a patristic scholar. He looked at the letters of Ignatius, the early church father, and identified the ones that were false and the ones that were genuine, in a way that most modern scholars would roughly accept still today. He did work on the creeds. He did work on the text of the Bible. He was a wonderful biblical textual scholar. He did work on history. He wrote the first history, if you like, of Christianity in Ireland, from the arrival of Patrick, the early Irish Christian history. He wrote a history of Gottschalk of Orbay, an early proponent of predestinarianism. He had this extraordinary gift for acquiring and remembering sources. One of the things that I do is I go around manuscript archives, particularly in Oxford and the British Library in London and Trinity College in Dublin, looking at Ussher's manuscripts, huge bound manuscript volumes, which contain all the notes he took during his academic life. And the range in that of his learning is quite terrifying. You feel deeply humble and actually quite miserable because you know you can never match the range of his learning.
And of course, there was a 19th century edition of Ussher's works that went on for umpteen volumes.
There was a 17-volume edition by Charles Elrington, a professor of divinity in Trinity, which was published from 1840s through to the 1860s. And this is still the standard edition of Ussher's works. It's good that we have it, but it's a terrible edition. The editing is crude. The way in which the letters in particular were edited doesn't help us much, hence the need for a new edition, hence the very welcome new edition. What Elrington tried to do was to position Ussher as, if you like, an Anglican cleric. Here was someone who studied the Church Fathers. He was therefore part almost of the Oxford movement. He was someone who respected tradition. He was opposed to Puritanism and Calvinism. Unfortunately, the image he created of Ussher was an absolute travesty of Ussher's life, because Ussher was himself a Calvinist. He was educated at a very Puritan institution at Trinity College, Dublin. And what we see here, if you like, is the way in which Ussher's reputation after his death was used and abused. He was someone who was such a distinguished scholar and such a good scholar that naturally you'd want his posthumous support. And people edited and used his works in order to support their particular interpretations. He was used, therefore, by Cardinal Newman in support of the Tracts for the Times. He was republished at the same time by an Irish evangelical clergyman, a man called Disney, some of what he called Ussher's prophecies, prophesying the dangers of the imminent arrival of Antichrist, which Disney was identifying with the Oxford movement. He was someone who, even down to the present day, is seen as both a Calvinist and an Anglican, a very strange combination. And there is a very strong nonconformist tradition of seeing Ussher as a hero, and also a very strong Anglican tradition of seeing Ussher as a classical Anglican scholar. He has this remarkable Janus-like ability, if you like, to face both ways.
And of course, he's seen as the almost, if creationists could have a patron saint, they would make Ussher their patron saint.
They would.
And yet, actually, when you think of his communications with other people in what they refer to as the Republic of Letters, he was actually one of the most creative theologians of his day. He would be the very opposite of the obscurantist approach to theology.
That is entirely true. It's a very difficult fact to get over to creationists. I did a search yesterday on the internet, on Google, of Ussher and 4004, and I got 90,000 hits.
Oh my God.
So basically, I can assure you, Ussher lives.
Alan, Ussher lives. Thank you for introducing him.